There is a continent at the bottom of the world that holds secrets older than memory, older than language, older than the oldest stories that any living person has ever been told. A land so ancient that the rocks beneath its red soil contain the signatures of events that happened before complex life existed on this planet. And scattered across that ancient ground, hidden beneath desert sand and dense rainforest canopy and the cold blue water of flooded coastal plains, there are places that people have sealed, closed off, restricted, forbidden, not because they are dangerous in the ordinary sense, not because of radiation or unstable ground or chemical contamination, but because what lies within them is so significant, so disruptive to the stories we tell ourselves about human history, so deeply sacred to the people who have known about them for tens of thousands of years, that the decision was made, sometimes quietly, sometimes after long and painful negotiation, to simply close the door, to say not yet, or perhaps not ever. Australia is the oldest inhabited continent on Earth. The people who first arrived on its shores did so at least 65,000 years ago, and some evidence now pushes that number even further back, toward 80,000 years, possibly more. They crossed open water to get there. They navigated by stars and currents and the flight paths of birds. They arrived in a land that was different from the one we see today, a land still shaped by Ice Age geography, where sea levels were low enough that vast coastal plains stretched out to the horizon, where rivers ran full and forests grew thick in places that are now bone-dry desert. And they stayed, they adapted, they developed the longest continuous cultural tradition in human history. 65,000 years of story, of ceremony, of accumulated knowledge about the land and the sky and the deep interconnection between all living things. And then Europeans arrived. And within the space of a few generations, that 65,000-year conversation with the land was interrupted, disrupted, in many places violently suppressed. The people who held the knowledge were pushed from their country. The sacred sites were built over or fenced off or simply forgotten by the newcomers who did not know what they were walking past. And so Australia became a continent with two layers of history sitting on top of each other. One ancient and deep and largely unwritten in any alphabet, the other recent and loud and recorded in newspapers and government documents and colonial ledgers. And between those two layers, in the gaps and the silences and the sealed off places, there is something extraordinary waiting. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it genuinely fascinates me. Someone in Sydney just before midnight, someone in the UK on a rainy afternoon, someone in Canada with snow falling outside the window, all of us drifting together through the same ancient story. Because that is what this is. A story, the longest story. And it is not finished yet. Tonight, we are going to travel across a continent. We are going to visit 10 places, some of which you will never be allowed to enter, some of which you could technically walk to but would be turned back from by law or by custom or by the quiet authority of people whose ancestors have protected those places for longer than most civilizations have existed. We are going to talk about what is known, what is suspected, what is sealed away, and why. We are going to let the mystery breathe, because some mysteries deserve to breathe. Some doors are closed for reasons that, when you understand them, make complete and even beautiful sense. So settle in, let your eyes grow heavy, let the details wash over you like water over old stone. By the time we reach the 10th site, the night will be deeper, and you will carry with you something you did not have before, a sense of how old this world really is, and how much of it we have not yet earned the right to see. The first site is one that most Australians have heard of, though most do not know the full story of what was found there, what was sealed, or why the authorities involved have remained so carefully, almost deliberately quiet about the details. It sits in the Northern Territory, in a region of sandstone escarpments and ancient river systems that the Bininj and Mungai peoples have occupied continuously for longer than any other group of humans has occupied any landscape on Earth. The broader area is known as Kakadu, but the specific site in question is not one that appears on tourist maps. It is known to researchers simply by a coordinate reference and a file number in the archives of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. The official record describes it as a restricted rock shelter complex, containing stratified cultural deposits of exceptional time depth. What that clinical language is describing, in the careful vocabulary of institutional understatement, is this: a cave system whose floor contains layer upon layer of human occupation going back, at the lowest and most ancient levels, to a time that would force a rewriting of everything we currently believe about when Australia was first settled and by whom. The excavation that reached those lowest levels was conducted in the late 1980s by a team of archaeologists working in partnership with the traditional custodians of the land. What they found when the results of the radiocarbon and thermoluminescence dating came back from the laboratory was so unexpected that the lead researcher reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before saying anything at all. The dates for the material in the lowest stratigraphic layer suggested human presence at a time when the prevailing scientific consensus said it was not possible, not difficult, not unlikely, actually impossible given the models of human migration and sea crossing capability that were accepted at the time. The numbers suggested that people had been living in this cave shelter during a period that predated the commonly accepted arrival of humans in Australia by a margin significant enough to require explanation. The site was sealed shortly afterward, not dramatically. There was no government order, no press conference, no public announcement. The excavation was simply closed, the trench was carefully backfilled, the rock shelter was placed under the joint management of the traditional custodians and the relevant government heritage authorities, with access restricted to researchers who had received explicit approval from both the Land Council and the heritage body. Approval that, in the decades since, has been granted only a handful of times and always under strict conditions of confidentiality regarding the specific dating results. When researchers have spoken about it at all, they have done so in the careful, hedging language of people who understand that they are touching something that the scientific community is not ready to absorb. The dates, one archaeologist told a colleague in a letter that was later cited in a footnote in an academic paper, are real. The methodology is sound. But what they mean is a conversation for another generation. Lie still for a moment and think about what that means. Not the specific numbers, because the specific numbers are still contested and still sealed. But the idea itself, that somewhere in a rock shelter in Kakadu, beneath layers of ochre and charcoal and the discarded tools of thousands of generations, there is a layer of human presence from a time that we have not yet fully reckoned with. That the people who say their ancestors have always been here are, in a sense that is more literal than poetic, correct. That the land holds a record older than our current understanding, and that the people who know about it most completely are the traditional custodians, for whom it is not a mystery at all, it is simply history. The second place takes us south and west to the Pilbara region of Western Australia, where the landscape is so ancient that the rocks themselves are among the oldest exposed geology on the surface of the earth. The Pilbara Craton, as geologists call it, contains rock formations dating back 3.5 billion years. Walking through it, you are walking across one of the oldest surfaces on this planet. The soil under your feet has been there in one form or another since before the first single-celled organisms learned to photosynthesize. It is a landscape that makes the word old feel inadequate. Scattered across this ancient ground are tens of thousands of petroglyphs, rock engravings, images pecked and ground into the hard surface of the Pilbara stone by human hands over a period of time that researchers are still working to fully understand. There are animal tracks and concentric circles and abstract geometric forms and images of animals that, in some cases, appear to represent species that have been extinct for thousands of years. There are human figures and therianthropes, beings that are partly human and partly animal, and images that repeat with such consistency across hundreds of kilometers that they clearly represent a shared symbolic vocabulary, a visual language that was maintained across an enormous territory for an enormous span of time. Most of these engravings are accessible to researchers and, in some areas, to the public. But there is one concentration of engravings in the Pilbara in a gorge system that the traditional owners of the country have asked not to be named in public documentation that is completely closed. The request for closure came from the elders of the relevant language group in the 1990s, following a period during which the site had been visited by a number of researchers whose published work, the elders felt, had treated the engravings in a way that stripped them of their living ceremonial context and reduced them to data points in an academic argument about prehistory. The elders were not wrong. There is a long history in Australian archaeology of treating Aboriginal cultural sites as sources of information for Western scientific narratives, rather than as living, active, spiritually significant places that belong to specific communities with specific protocols about who may see them and under what conditions. The closure of this particular gorge system was one of the more significant moments in the shifting relationship between Australian archaeology and Aboriginal land rights, because it demonstrated clearly and without ambiguity that the traditional custodians had both the legal authority and the cultural confidence to say, "This place is ours and you may not enter it." What makes the closure remarkable from a purely archaeological perspective is what researchers who had visited the site before the closure have described in careful and somewhat awed language. The gorge contains engravings of a style that does not clearly match any of the identified artistic traditions of the region's recent past. They are not consistent with the panoramidi style that dominates much of inland Australian rock art. They are not consistent with the figurative traditions of the Pilbara's more recent periods. They are something older, something that represents a visual tradition so ancient that it predates the stylistic sequences that archaeologists have been able to identify and date across the rest of the continent. Some of the figures depicted in the gorge may represent megafauna. the giant marsupials and enormous birds and reptiles that roamed Australia during the Pleistocene and were largely extinct by 40,000 years ago. If that interpretation is correct, which would need to be confirmed by dating that has not been permitted, then those engravings would be among the oldest representational art ever created by human hands anywhere on Earth. Older than Lascaux, older than Chauvet, older than the Indonesian cave paintings that currently hold the record for the world's earliest figurative art. By a margin that would be, if confirmed, extraordinary. The elders who close the gorge know what is in there. They have always known. It is, by their account, a place of significant power and significant danger, a site associated with aspects of ceremonial life that are not for general viewing. The question of when or whether the broader world will ever have access to what those walls contain is not a scientific question. It is a question about sovereignty and trust and the repair of a relationship that was badly broken and is still slowly being rebuilt. For now, the gorge sits in its ancient landscape, unchanged by the debates about it. The engravings are there in the dark and the heat, just as they have been for thousands of years, patiently waiting. The third site exists in two worlds simultaneously. In the world of contemporary land management and heritage law, it is designated as a restricted access zone within a national park in Queensland, specifically in the wet tropics region of the far north, where the rainforest that clings to the coastal ranges is among the oldest continuously surviving tropical rainforest in the world. In the world of the Jabugai and Yurganiji peoples, whose country this has been since the rainforest itself was young, it is something that does not translate cleanly into the language of heritage management. It is a place that is alive, a place that has agency, a place that, in a sense, that requires a different framework than Western science currently provides, acts upon those who enter it. The physical description is straightforward enough. It is a series of rock shelters arranged along a sandstone ridge, connected by narrow passages and opening onto ledges with views across the rainforest canopy to the coast. The shelters contain artwork in red and yellow and white pigments, overlapping in many layers, with the older layers visible through the newer ones in places where the surface has flaked away. There are hand stencils and animal figures and the same repertoire of abstract marks that appears throughout Australian rock art, but arranged in configurations that researchers who have visited the site before its full closure in the early 2000s described as unlike anything else they had seen in the region. The closure was triggered by a combination of factors. There was a vandalism incident in the 1990s in which several panels of artwork were damaged by visitors who should not have been there. There was a growing recognition among the traditional custodians that the management framework that had been in place since the national park was established was not adequately protecting either the physical site or its ceremonial significance. And there was a request from the senior women of the relevant language group, who are the primary custodians of the ceremony associated with the shelters, that the site be closed to all non-custodian access, including archaeological research, indefinitely. What makes this site particularly fascinating is what the researchers who visited it before closure documented, but have not, for the most part, published in full. Among the layers of artwork, they identified a series of images that appear to depict a landscape that no longer exists. Specifically, figures that seem to represent a coastline and a river system that would correspond to the geography of the region during a period of significantly lower sea levels, when what is now the continental shelf was dry land and the coastline was many kilometers further east than it is today. If that interpretation is correct, those images are a visual record of a landscape that was last visible somewhere between 10,000 and 18,000 years ago, when the sea levels of the post-glacial period had not yet risen to their current position. Think about what it would mean to carry a visual record of a landscape across 10,000 years of oral and ceremonial tradition, to look at a painting on a rock wall and recognize it as a picture of a place that your ancestors saw, that is now beneath the ocean. To have that knowledge not as an abstract historical fact, but as a living part of your ceremonial understanding of country. The Jabugai and Yirganiji elders, when they speak about this site at all, speak about it as a record, a memory held in the stone, which is precisely why it is not for casual viewing. Memories of that kind, that old, that significant, require a specific kind of care. The shelters sit in the rainforest now, green and dripping and alive as they have always been. The birds that nest in the overhangs are the same species or close descendants of the same species that nested there when the images were first made. The art continues to breathe in the humid air, protected now by the decision of the women who have always been its rightful guardians. The fourth site takes us to a place that most people would not think of as an archaeological site at all. It sits on the continental shelf off the coast of South Australia, beneath roughly 35 meters of water in what is now Spencer Gulf. It was identified in the early 2000s by a commercial fishing vessel whose sonar equipment detected an anomaly on the seafloor, a pattern of regular depressions that did not match any natural geological feature. The vessel's captain, who was an amateur historian with an interest in Australian prehistory, recognized the significance of what his sonar was showing and contacted a marine archaeologist at a South Australian university. What followed was a period of investigation that produced results that the researchers involved have been cautious, some would say carefully reluctant, to discuss in public. The seafloor anomalies, when examined by remotely operated underwater cameras, appeared to be the remains of a human habitation site, not a wreck, not a colonial era structure, something much older than that. Circular depressions that could be the foundations of dwelling structures, linear features that might be pathways or drainage channels, and scattered among these features, objects that appeared to be stone tools of a type consistent with Australian Aboriginal technology of the Pleistocene period. The site would have been above water during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were low enough to expose large areas of what is now the shallow continental shelf. It would have been a coastal settlement, perhaps a fishing community, perhaps a seasonal camp, on the shores of what was then a very different Spencer Gulf. The people who lived there would have seen the sea level rising over the course of their lifetimes and the lifetimes of their children and their children's children. The slow creep of water across the land that is encoded in Aboriginal oral traditions from coastal communities across Australia as stories of a great inundation, a time when the sea came in and swallowed the country. The site is not accessible to recreational divers. It is not marked on any public chart. The exact coordinates have not been published in any peer-reviewed paper. The South Australian government, in consultation with the native title holders of the relevant sea country, placed a voluntary moratorium on further investigation pending the development of an appropriate research framework that adequately incorporates Aboriginal authority over the site's management. That moratorium has been in place in various forms for over 2 decades. The reasons are partly logistical. Underwater archaeological investigation of a site at that depth requires significant resources and careful planning, but the reasons are also cultural. The sea country in that region belongs to the Narunga people, among others, and the question of whether, how, and under what conditions a sunken settlement of their ancestors should be investigated by academic institutions is not a simple one. It is a question about who owns the past, who gets to decide what is known and what remains unknown, whose framework of understanding gets to interpret what is found. Lying in the dark tonight, you might let your mind go down there, to the cold water and the dim green light and the shapes in the sediment that were once walls and pathways and the places where people sat to clean fish and watch the sun go down over a coast that no longer exists. The water over them is not cold storage, it is an archive. And archives, as anyone who has ever worked in one knows, are not just collections of information, they are also collections of silences. The fifth place is in the heart of the continent, in the red desert country of the Western Desert region, in a location that the relevant communities prefer not to have disclosed. I will describe it as it has been described to me by a researcher who visited it once with permission and who chose afterward not to publish the GPS coordinates or the specific language group association out of respect for a request made clearly and directly by the senior custodians. It is a soak, a place where water comes to the surface in an otherwise waterless landscape, creating a small, persistent wetness in the red sand and the spinifex. And around that soak, across an area of perhaps 2 hectares, there is a concentration of stone artifacts unlike anything else in the Western Desert. Not just the usual scatters of flaked stone that accumulate anywhere people have been living and working. Something more deliberate than that. Arrangements of stone that appear to have been placed rather than discarded. Geometric configurations, some of them quite large, covering tens of square meters. And at the center of it all, a grinding stone of extraordinary size, too large to have been carried to this location without significant effort, smoothed by what must have been many thousands of hours of use. The researcher who visited described standing at the center of the arrangement and feeling with a certainty that she found difficult to articulate in scientific language, that she was standing in a place of enormous significance, that the arrangement of stones around her was not accidental, that she was in the middle of something that had been built and used and maintained over a very long period of time for purposes that she could not fully see, but could, in some way that she struggled to explain, partially sense. The elders who accompanied her on the visit told her that the site is associated with ceremonies that are conducted during specific astronomical events, that the arrangement of the stones corresponds to a map of something in the sky, that the grinding stone at the center is not just a tool for processing food, but a site of specific ceremonial activity that has been conducted at that location for longer than the elders' own knowledge can reach. They told her that their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents had spoken of the site in the same way they spoke of it, as something that has always been there, that has always been used in the same way, that will always be there and will always be used in the same way, long after the current generation of custodians has passed. The site is sealed not by law, but by custom. There is no fence, there is no sign, there is no heritage register entry. Access is controlled entirely by the authority of the custodians, which in the Western Desert tradition is sufficient authority. The researcher who visited was invited because she had built a relationship of trust with the community over many years, and because the elders felt that having one careful outsider witness to the site's existence was, at that particular moment, in the community's interest. She has not been back. She does not know if she will be invited again. What she does know, and what she has written about in the most oblique terms in papers that deal with other subjects, is that the site appears to be very old, older than the current cultural landscape of the Western Desert, which itself goes back thousands of years. Something about the patination of the stones, the depth to which the arrangement is embedded in the surface of the ground, the style of the flaked artifacts scattered around the edges, suggests a time depth that is significant. She does not know how significant. She suspects that if the site were ever formally investigated, with the custodian's permission and under their direction, the results would be surprising, perhaps startling. For now, it sits in the desert, surrounded by spinifex and silence, exactly as it has sat for as long as anyone can remember. The sixth site is different from the others because it is not entirely sealed. You can visit part of it. You can walk through the lower sections of the cave system, guided by a ranger, paying the entry fee, listening to the recorded commentary that plays through a small speaker at each marked stopping point. The cave is beautiful. The formations are extraordinary. It is, by any measure, one of the more remarkable underground landscapes in Australia, and it is a legitimate tourist attraction with a well-maintained visitor centre and a car park, and a small cafe that serves reasonable coffee. But below the tourist levels, below the passages that the ranger leads you through, there is another section of the cave system that is not on the tour, that has never been on any tour, that is accessible only through a passage that has been fitted with a locked gate, and the key to that gate is held by a heritage management committee that meets twice a year and has, to date, never issued an access permit to any researcher who has applied. The cave system is in the Nullarbor Plain, on the edge of the Great Australian Bight, in a region of the continent that is limestone karst country, pocked with sinkholes and caves and underground passages that carry ancient water through the rock. The system that tourists visit is one of several in the area, but it is the one that was developed for public access in the 1970s, and it is the one that, during the development process, yielded a discovery that was recorded in the site management files and then, with a thoroughness that required deliberate effort, kept out of any publication or public communication. The discovery was a lower chamber, not dramatic in its appearance. The chamber itself is modest by cave system standards, perhaps 15 meters across and 4 meters high, but the floor of the chamber is covered with a sediment deposit that contains, according to the brief and incomplete account in the site management files, paleontological and cultural material of extraordinary significance. The paleontological component refers to the bones of megafauna species, not just isolated bones which are found in Nullarbor caves regularly enough to be unremarkable, but articulated skeletons, animals that fell into the cave system and were not scavenged, and so preserved in the positions in which they died, giving researchers a window into the physiology and behavior of species that have been extinct for tens of thousands of years. The cultural component is the sensitive part. Among the megafauna bones, and in some cases apparently in direct association with them, there are stone artifacts, tools, the kind of tools that human hands make. And if those tools are genuinely associated with those megafauna bones, then what is preserved in that sediment is evidence of humans and extinct megafauna in the same place at the same time, which would be significant for the ongoing debate about whether human hunting contributed to the extinction of Australia's Pleistocene megafauna. It would be significant enough that various interested parties, including researchers who support different sides of that debate, have extremely strong feelings about what should happen to the material in that chamber. The gate remains locked. The committee meets and does not issue access permits. The beautiful formations above continue to delight tourists. And below, in the sediment of the lower chamber, the bones and the tools lie together in the dark, carrying a story about a time when the humans who had crossed the water to reach this continent were still learning what that continent contained, still encountering for the first time creatures that were larger and stranger than anything they had known before. The seventh site is in Tasmania, on the west coast of that island state, in a wilderness that is as remote and as difficult to traverse as any landscape in Australia. The Tasmanian west coast is a place of almost mythological wildness, of ancient rainforest and buttongrass plains and mountain ranges cut by rivers of extraordinary beauty and fury. It is a place that resisted European settlement for a very long time, not because of any deliberate decision, but simply because it is so difficult to move through and so unforgiving to those who attempt it without adequate preparation. The Palawa people, the Aboriginal Tasmanians, had lived in and through that landscape for at least 40,000 years before European contact. They had developed in that time a relationship with the West Coast's resources and geography that was precise and sophisticated, a knowledge of the rivers and the coastline and the seasonal movements of the animals that sustained them. And they left throughout that landscape evidence of their presence, middens along the coast, cave shelters in the mountains, stone arrangements in the button grass, rock art in places that are still being discovered. The specific site I'm describing here was found not by an archaeologist, but by a bushwalker in the mid-1990s, a man who had been walking the West Coast wilderness for many years, and who came on a rainy afternoon into a rock shelter that he had not found before. What he saw inside the shelter stopped him where he stood. The walls were covered in engravings, not painted but carved, ground into the surface of the rock with a tool or tools that must have required sustained and deliberate effort. The engravings covered every accessible surface of the shelter. They range from simple linear marks to complex geometric forms to what appeared to be representational images, though of what exactly he could not at first determine. He had the presence of mind not to touch anything. He took careful notes and some photographs, and when he emerged from the wilderness several days later, he reported his find to the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service, which in turn contacted the Aboriginal Land Council of Tasmania, the body responsible for managing the interests of the Palawa people in relation to heritage sites. The response was swift and, to the bushwalker, somewhat surprising. He had expected excitement. What he received instead was gratitude, but also a firm and immediate request that the location be kept confidential. The Land Council, in consultation with Palawa elders, determined that the site should be sealed, no further visitor access, no research access, no documentation beyond what was necessary to register the site in the Confidential Heritage Register, no publication of any findings. The reasons given publicly were brief. The site is of sacred significance. Its protection requires restricted access. End of statement. But in conversations with researchers who have spoken carefully with Palawa community members over the years since the discovery, a more layered picture has emerged. The engravings in that shelter are associated with knowledge that was believed to have been lost, knowledge that was suppressed during the period of colonial violence against the Palawa people, a period so brutal and so thorough that for many years it was believed that the Palawa had been entirely exterminated. They had not been, but their knowledge systems had been severely damaged, and much of what the elders of the early colonial period had held had not been passed on in the way it should have been. The engravings in the West Coast shelter, by the account of those few Palawa elders who have been permitted to visit them, contain references to ceremony and law and cosmological understanding that were thought to be gone. Seeing them was, by all accounts, a profound and complex experience, not simply joy, something more tangled than joy, the recognition that something lost was not entirely lost, that the stone had held it, waiting for as long as it took for the people to come back. That is why the site is sealed. It is not sealed to protect it from damage, though that is also a concern. It is sealed because what it contains belongs to the Palawa people in the deepest sense of belonging, and the process of working with that knowledge, of receiving it properly and integrating it back into living cultural practice, requires time and privacy and the absence of outside observers whose presence would change the nature of the encounter. The eighth site is the most scientifically controversial of all the places we are visiting tonight, because the material found there, if the interpretation that was initially proposed by the researchers who found it is correct, would require a revision not just of Australian prehistory, but of the globally accepted timeline of human cognitive development. The site is in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, in a creek bed that, during periods of flooding, exposes sediment layers from deep in the geological record. Fossickers and fossil hunters have been working the Flinders Ranges for generations, and the creek beds yield significant finds from time to time, usually paleontological rather than archaeological, bones of ancient animals preserved in the sediment. What was found in this particular creek bed by a geologist who was there to look at the rock formations rather than search for artifacts was a piece of ochre. That is not in itself remarkable. Ochre is found in archaeological contexts across Australia. What was remarkable was the geological layer in which the piece of ochre was embedded, and the fact that the ochre had been processed. It had been deliberately ground. There were marks on its surface that were consistent with a grinding stone having been used to produce pigment from it, which is one of the oldest and most widespread of all human technological behaviors, but which, in this case, was occurring in a sediment layer whose date, according to the geologist's reading of the stratigraphy, was very much earlier than the accepted date for human arrival in Australia. The geologist, understanding the implications, contacted a paleoanthropologist at an Adelaide university who visited the site and agreed that the stratigraphy appeared to be what it appeared to be. A small excavation was undertaken quietly with minimal documentation. More processed ochre was found, and a single piece of worked stone, a flake detached from a larger piece by deliberate percussion, whose fresh surface was still sharp. The dates proposed for the sediment layer put the material in a time period that, if correct, would mean that humans or something behaving indistinguishably from humans were present in South Australia at a time when, according to the current scientific consensus, No anatomically modern human had yet left Africa. This is not a minor revision. This is not a matter of pushing an accepted date back by a few thousand years. If the interpretation is correct, it changes everything. The site was sealed almost immediately after the implications became clear. The decision was made by the research team in consultation with the State Heritage Authority and with the Adnyamathanha people, the traditional custodians of the Flinders Ranges, who were not surprised by the find in the way that the scientists were. The Adnyamathanha oral traditions speak of a presence in that country that extends back beyond counting, beyond even the memory of the oldest stories. They did not need a sediment date to tell them that their people had been there for a very long time. Access to the creek bed is not formally restricted because there is no legal mechanism to restrict access to a creek bed, but the precise location of the find has not been published. The excavation notes are held in a locked archive. The ochre and the stone flake are in a storage facility at the university, awaiting a time when the scientific community has developed better tools for investigating and interpreting material of this kind without the interpretation being distorted by the weight of what is at stake. That time has not yet come. The creek still floods every winter. The sediment still moves. And somewhere in that ancient landscape, in layers of red and yellow earth, there may be more material waiting to be found. More evidence of a presence that complicates the story we have been telling ourselves about the origins of our species and the antiquity of human habitation on this continent. The ninth site is the only one of the 10 we are visiting tonight that involves a structure. Not a natural formation, not a cave or a rock shelter or a surface scatter of artifacts, but something that was deliberately built, something that required planning and effort and the cooperation of a group of people working toward a shared purpose. It is in the tablelands of North Queensland, in cattle country now, in a landscape of brown grass and eucalyptus and the slow, wide channels of seasonal rivers. The property on which it sits has changed hands several times over the decades since it was first documented, and the current owners, who bought it from an estate in the early 2010s, were not aware when they purchased the land that it included a significant archaeological site on a back section of their property, more than an hour's drive from the homestead, in a part of the land that is difficult to access and that they had not visited in detail before the purchase. What they found when they eventually made their way to that part of the property was a stone arrangement of remarkable size and regularity, a series of parallel stone rows, each row running approximately north-south, spaced at regular intervals, extending over an area of several hectares. The stones are not large, most of them are the size of a human head or smaller, and they have not been shaped or worked in any obvious way, but they have been placed. Someone chose those stones, carried them to their positions, and arranged them in a pattern that, from ground level, is difficult to perceive as pattern, but that, from elevation, is unmistakably deliberate. The station owners contacted the Queensland State Heritage Authority, who sent an archaeologist who contacted the local native title body, who initiated a consultation with elders of the language group whose country the site falls within. The consultation produced a heritage agreement and an access restriction. The site was registered on the confidential section of the Queensland Heritage Register, meaning that the public register records its existence but not its location or description. And a management plan was developed that restricts access to the Land Council, the site custodians, and researchers who have obtained specific permission from both. The archaeologist who first visited the site wrote in his internal report that the arrangement reminded him of no other Australian site he had seen, and that its closest analogues in the published literature were astronomically aligned stone arrangements from other parts of the world, from sites in Scotland and northern Africa and the American Southwest. He noted that without detailed survey work and appropriate dating methods, he could not determine either the age of the arrangement or its purpose, but that both warranted investigation. Investigation that, given the access restrictions, has not yet taken place. The elders of the relevant language group know what the arrangement is. They have not chosen to share that knowledge in any forum that is accessible to the general public. What is known is that the site is described in the Heritage Agreement as a site of special ceremonial significance associated with astronomical observation. What that means in practice, what the arrangement was designed to track or celebrate or invoke, is a form of knowledge that belongs to specific people and is not for general circulation. The cattle station is still a working property. The owners have fenced the relevant section of their land and placed a locked gate on the track that leads to it. They have, by all accounts, been respectful and cooperative in their dealings with the heritage process. The stone rows sit in the long grass, visible from above on satellite imagery if you know what you're looking at and where to look, invisible and unsuspected to the cattle that graze around them. The 10th and final site is the one I've been saving, not because it is the most dramatic, though it may be. Not because it is the most controversial, though the few people who know its full story would perhaps say it is that too, but because of all the places we have visited tonight, this one holds within it the most complete version of the question that runs through all the others. What is the true depth of human presence in Australia? And what would it mean for all of us to know the answer? The site is known to the researchers who are aware of it as Site OB7. The designation is deliberately opaque, assigned by a small team of researchers who agreed early in their investigation that they would use a non-geographic reference to reduce the risk of the location being identified from published work. OB stands for the name of the region, which I'm also not going to provide because the custodians of the site have specifically requested that the general area not be identified. 7 is simply a file number. What it is, in physical terms, is a stratified rock shelter site on the coast of a southern state of Australia. The rock shelter itself is unremarkable in appearance. Coastal sandstone, a moderate overhang, a sandy floor. From a distance, it would not draw your eye. From close up, if you did not know what to look for, it might still not draw your eye. But the floor of that shelter contains a sequence of cultural deposits whose depth and whose age range are, according to the researchers who have investigated it, among the most significant findings in the history of Australian archaeology. The investigation began as a survey, a systematic recording of coastal archaeological sites in a region that was being assessed for potential development. The lead archaeologist noticed that the sandy floor of the shelter showed a particular kind of compaction that sometimes indicates deep stratified deposits beneath the surface. She requested permission from the traditional custodians to undertake a small test excavation, a probe to determine the depth of the deposit. Permission was granted. What the probe found before it stopped at 1.5 meters below the surface, because the team had reached the limit of what they could safely excavate in a probe trench, was an unbroken sequence of cultural material. Layer upon layer of charcoal and ochre and flaked stone and organic material, each layer separated from the next by a thin band of sterile sediment that indicated a period of disuse, each layer containing material consistent with sustained human habitation. The team sent samples from each layer to a laboratory for optically stimulated luminescence dating, and then they waited. And when the results came back several weeks later, the lead archaeologist reportedly read the numbers several times before she was confident she was reading them correctly. The lowest layer for which they had been able to obtain a sample from the base of their probe trench at 1.5 meters below the surface had a date of extraordinary depth, a date that placed human occupation of that shelter in a period that, if confirmed, would make it one of the oldest definitively dated occupation sites anywhere in the world, not just in Australia. In the world. The date was not a revised estimate of when humans arrived in Australia. It was a number that raised questions not about Australian prehistory, but about human prehistory more broadly. The team immediately halted the excavation. They met with the custodians. They discussed, over several days of careful conversation, what to do. The custodians were not, it must be said, surprised. Their traditions speak of this stretch of coast as among the oldest inhabited places in their country, as a place where the relationship between the people and the land began as the point of the original arrival. They had been saying this for as long as their stories could be traced. The dating, from their perspective, was confirmation of something already known. The decision that was reached was collective. The site would be sealed. No further investigation. No publication of the dating results. The findings would be shared with the relevant state heritage authority under a confidentiality agreement. The probe trench would be carefully backfilled and the shelter left in its natural state. A heritage protection order would be placed over it, giving the traditional custodians full authority over any future access. The lead archaeologist honored that agreement. She has spoken about Site OB7 only in the most general terms, in contexts where she was discussing the broader question of how the Australian archaeological community handles its relationship with Aboriginal communities and heritage. She has said that she found the site and found the experience of working there and ultimately of not publishing what she found to be the most significant and the most difficult professional experience of her life. She has said that she believes the custodians made the right decision. She has said in a single sentence in a paper about research ethics that the findings from OB7 will, when the time comes for them to be shared, change the way we understand human history when the time comes. That phrase carries a great deal in it. It carries the weight of a relationship that is still being repaired. The weight of a scientific community that is still learning how to hold knowledge that has been entrusted to it rather than captured by it. The weight of a tradition that is 65,000 years old and that has survived everything that has been thrown at it, and that is, with careful deliberateness, deciding what to do next with what it holds. The shelter is there on the coast, facing the sea, as it has faced the sea for all of that time. The wind comes off the water and moves through the overhang. The sand on the floor shifts slightly with each season. Below the surface, the layers wait. The charcoal and the ochre and the stone, the signatures of people who were here before almost anything else that we call human history had happened anywhere on Earth. 10 sites, 10 silences, 10 places where the door is closed and the key is held by the right hands. There is a way of thinking about sealed archaeological sites that makes them feel like losses. All that knowledge locked away. All that potential understanding of who we are and where we came from, withheld from the world. And there is some truth in that feeling. The desire to know is one of the most genuinely human of all impulses, and the frustration of that desire can feel sharp. But There is another way to hold these silences, a way that takes seriously the idea that knowledge is not simply information, that it exists in relationship, that the conditions under which something